This is the Avocado Project. We have a special guest today on the Avocado Project, but before we introduce our first ever guest on the podcast, today's episode is about the coffee culture, the caffeine craze in Australia, that strong brew that is fixed in so many people's daily rituals. Our special guest is also named Matt, who is a certified specialty coffee roaster that runs a small business called Coffee Logick with a K at the end from Queensland. Welcome to the Avocado Project, Matt. How are you? How's it going?
It is absolutely fantastic to be here, gentlemen. I do appreciate it. It is going splendid.
Look, we're going to have to call you Coffee Matt, so we can, because there's two Matts in the call. There's two Matts in the call. Now, I got to ask you, Matt, Coffee Matt, have you had a coffee today?
So this morning I started with the traditional long black, just an espresso made at home.
How much coffee do you drink a day?
To give a little bit of context, I am currently on a little bit of annual leave, so my coffee consumption drastically increases in the early morning. But look, here's the thing. I try to keep it to around 2 to 3 cups of coffee a day, especially while working, and I try to pace it out, all of it done by, I'd say, 12 o'clock. But, on special occasions, which is not being at work, it's a lot more than that.
But do you remember the first ever coffee you had?
If we're talking the drink that got me caffeinated, yes.
Set the scene for us.
It was about 20 years ago, maybe a little bit longer than that. My older brother at the time was in the military, and he came home from a bit of a stint up in the Solomon Islands, and he decided to make a brew of sorts. It was a whole heap of international roast mixed with a hell of a lot of sugar and milk. Some sort of form of other liquid was in there, stirred and then served. It was absolutely disgusting, but I loved every minute of it.
But it just reminds me of the Coles instant coffee. Pretty sure that was one of the ones I had when I was younger, and it was probably the worst introduction to coffee that I've ever had. But eventually moved up to Nescafe, and now, as a true connoisseur, I've now moved on to beans, and I've been in love ever since.
I mean, look, we've all had that awful introduction into coffee, which is just some sort of black sludge mixed with some other liquid.
That's it.
That is true.
You don't even drink coffee, Axel.
I have a confession, guys. I drink coffee maybe once every now and then. I never really jumped on the bandwagon.
Straight sacrilege. What is this noise? One of these days, let me send you a small bag as a gift of something really nice, and then I can walk you through the process.
You're going to get me hooked and addicted.
That's
That's
point.
good.
That's the plan.
I'll send you both a gift. I'll send you a little 250-gram bag each, and we'll organise those details after we finish here. But no, I want to send you something nice that I roasted myself to give you a bit of an introduction into, the personal views of coffee and also the industry at large.
I do have just a small little question just for you, Coffee Matt. Earlier on, Axel and I were talking about different types of coffee, and since he doesn't drink it as much, I wanted to know what type of coffee you like in terms of beans. What is your favorite?
In terms of beans, look, I being a coffee roaster, I do break it down into the actual country that I go to, and then something called the cultivar. So specifically, the strain of coffee on the tree at a particular farm. I have a huge preference for Ethiopian coffee, the heirloom cultivars, which is a grouping of cultivars, not just one particular tree, but a variety of them. And about, I'd say 12 years ago, I was introduced to a coffee by a friend who now lives overseas, and he gave me this Ethiopian coffee from the Guji region.
Is this the Ethiopia Guji Danze Mamora?
That's exactly right. So this is the coffee that got me into specialty coffee in a big way. Got it roasted by the roastery he was working for, which is based in Brisbane, Clean Skin Coffee. And the roast itself was a filter roast, so a lighter roast than most of the time. And it highlighted flavors of cola, chocolate, and blueberries, and it blew my mind. These are in the early days when, I didn't really understand filter coffee in the same kind of capacity that I do now, but it was something that was just so different than what I was used to, essentially espresso on milk, your chocolates, your caramels, the traditional coffee tasting coffee. that this thing just enthralled me. And this amount of time later, I managed to find that exact coffee from one of the importers that I use to get the green coffee. And full circle moment, and it's still my favorite coffee.
What was the biggest mistake you've made since getting into roasting? And, how did you learn from that mistake?
I think there's two. The first one is buying either too much or not enough stock. And I think the too much stock is the real problem there. And then the second one was not trusting my palate enough and worrying about the coffee. Obviously, I'm a small roaster. For context sake, I only have a 1 kilo roaster. So I'm very, very, very small scale.
Yeah.
The kind of technology that I have is very good. It allows me to do batch to batch roasts quite quickly and very consistently. And so for me, I can repeat the process a number of times. But then I overestimated my first few months of roasting coffee in that I was like, oh, X amount of kilos will be enough. I was under that with a couple of orders, and then I had to kind of like figure out what I was doing from there. Now, thankfully, it was a minor mistake because I had enough friends in the industry that owned different roasteries around the Sunshine Coast that I was able to kind of call in some favors. And thankfully, one of my friends had the exact same coffee, and he was able to sell me a box of that coffee at that time, and that really helped me out.
What a coincidence.
Yeah, well, I mean, a very, very happy accident, and thankfully he's a good friend of mine, and he's also a very good coffee roaster. I guess the big one with that first one is that I oversold and underdelivered. Now, thankfully, I
Yeah.
was able to rectify it before it became a problem. The stress of it behind the scenes for a 4 or 5 day stretch was enough to get me to analyze what do I need to do with my stock levels and what do I need to say to my custom in a transparency sort of way to make sure that I can deliver what I promise. The second one was I was so worried about the coffee or the quality of the coffee that I was roasting. I mean, the equipment that I've got is good. It gives me great output for the information that I need to be able to see how the roast is going. It allows me to look at the coffee after the fact, and when I do some quality control, which we call cupping, when
Yeah.
I do the cupping and whatnot, I can kind of track back and go, oh, I can see where it's dried out a little bit, or why it tastes a little bit like this and like this. But I was so fixated on trying to achieve a flavor that I held on to this one particular coffee, which I've still got 3 years post the purchase. And I was just terrified of selling it because I'm like, everyone's going to hate it. Everyone's going to hate it.
Really?
And it was this
Wow.
very self-defeatist mentality that stopped me from selling an otherwise really, really expensive and good quality coffee that I should have just given to people.
Yeah. I mean, there's only one way of determining whether you've roasted a really good coffee or bean. You have to let people decide with their palates, right? And their taste. How much does all the equipment cost? Like the equipment that you have currently, how much did that all cost you?
For knowledge sake, the roaster that I'm using is called the Ileo Bullet. It's a
Okay.
company that have been around for about 6, 7 years, but they've made this really cool technology. For industry clarification, the average 1 kilo roaster that's gas fired, so you need your gas setup, you need all of the
Yeah.
certifications, blah blah blah, could cost you anywhere from say $15,000 to $25,000.
What?
This is the cool part about this time in the industry as well. The roaster
Yep.
that I bought is actually it's induction, so it acts like a gas roaster in the way in which it heats up the drum, and it only cost me $7,000.
7,000. Okay. Yeah.
In a manner of speaking, I'm already ahead. And from there, I still had to pick up stock itself and bags and sealing machines and computer to run some things. So really, to start off, I probably invested around $10,000.
Is that a conservative amount or is that usually what you'd spend for a small scale?
Look, it's very small scale. It's very conservative, and that was including, say, my first 60 kilos of green coffee,
Yeah.
with no real knowledge of going, how much do I need to make in a return in order to, pay down what I've invested, but also make a little bit of profit on top to invest in more stock. So it was a bit of a stab in the dark.
Yeah.
I look the average. If you were wanting to start up a coffee roastery in order to supply wholesale and retail,
Yep.
small scale, you wouldn't be averse to dropping, $80 to $180,000
Wow.
in relation to kind of future proofing yourself with like 3 months worth of stock and expectations for repairs and breakdowns and basic wage costs for one other person to help you. Like it's a pretty critical breakdown that I've gone through, but I'm happy to stay small for the moment.
When you got people in Australia roasting their own beans and supplying it out, I think it really shows that, Australia, and they do take a lot of pride in the coffee that they consume and also what they provide. And something that I've always found interesting is that if you go overseas, people will drink pretty average coffee and not think twice about it. But over here, if a cafe makes a bad coffee once, people will talk about it for weeks and they'll never go back. Why do you think we seem to care so much more about coffee than other countries?
That's a very good question. After doing research in the industry, for a bit of context, a couple of years ago, I was working for a specialty coffee roastery, and I had the opportunity to deep dive into the history of coffee um,
Mhm.
from the drinking perspective and the production perspective too.
Yeah.
What we've done is we've looked at the way that coffee has changed over, say, the last 200 years, particularly the last 150, I'd say, and gone, what was the commonality for people to experience coffee? Where did they go? How did they have it? And what was the end result? And because look, majority of Australians drink espresso based coffee. We're talking espresso machines in a cafe served with milk, and that's kind of 85 to 90% of the industry, right?
Right.
Espresso in relation to the production of coffee is probably one of the newer, if not the newest form of making coffee. It's only been around since about the 1860s, but only really popularized towards the end of the 1800s to the early 1900s. And so terms like espresso and cappuccino, Italian words that mean something, were only really popularized in, say, the 1940s onwards, particularly post World War II, when it started to come from Europe into America and then become in vogue through mass media. And then
Right.
we look back at that and go, look, this is the second wave of coffee. To really put it into its points, the first wave of coffee was really just we have this particular bean or seed of this cherry, which we roast in some fashion. We grind it really fine, we chuck it in a tin, and we send it off to people so they can have a coffee in their homes. Around the 1960s to 80s, people differ on the points. The second wave of coffee really begins where people started to go out for a coffee. So it was produced in a business somewhere where you could go and enjoy it. And this is where latte becomes a popular term, cappuccino becomes more popularized. And you see people begin to go out for a coffee experience, and you also get the introduction of companies like Starbucks, like the origin of those old coffee companies that have still continued through the chain coffee companies and things. And that was really the second wave of coffee. And I believe I can never remember his name, Tim something or other, in about the year 2000 2001, coined the term third wave coffee, where now with the understanding of agricultural sciences, with how we can look at food science, with how we can enjoy things to a much greater degree, and with
Yep.
also the decrease in quality of machinery that people can use to quantify things like the quality of said products. The third wave of coffee was really looking at the origin of the coffee, the farm itself, looking at the specifics between the different kinds of coffees.
Yeah,
Wow.
okay.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this before the episode. Before most people got into something, they're kind of oblivious to what goes on behind the scenes. Like you can enjoy a meal without knowing how to cook, or enjoy a car without knowing how an engine works.
Yeah.
But now you're actually roasting your own beans and experimenting with different roasts, and you're trying to get consistency and paying attention to all of the little details that most people would never think about. Like you're telling me, there's amazing different stories like the origin, and you're talking about third wave coffee and what you're looking for, and
Mm.
Australians and the quality that we look for and the standards that we hold so high.
Mm.
All of this put together, has it changed the way you look at coffee? Like, have you become more judgmental about it?
Yes. I guess the industry chagrin we feel for larger roasters is probably the thing to blame, because you've got this idea of, and look, let me say this in a strange way, I think the underdog nature of the Australian, how we value the underdog, the up and comer, the one who is going to make it and hasn't made it yet, is probably one of the driving forces behind the quality of the cup that we're chasing. We look at companies, and I don't want to throw them under the bus in a negative way, but I will be
Name it.
honest about it and name them. Grinders Coffee are probably the worst.
Wait, where are they
I
based?
think they're definitely
Melbourne?
down in Melbourne, yeah, and
Oh,
they've got
God.
they've
Wait,
got massive
Grinders
roast.
coffee?
Yeah, so that's Coca-Cola.
Holy shit. Oh, sorry,
Yeah,
sorry
right?
to interject on here. I've I've drank Grinder's coffee before. I had the creamer one.
My
Oh.
apologies.
I just want to quickly jump in here. When I had the Grinder's coffee, it tasted like if you were to water down cordial.
Oh, yeah.
I had a friend, I'll leave him unnamed because of his position, but I have a friend
Yep.
who was recently approached by grinders to do a spot for them, so to speak. And he did a little spot for them and did a little bit of quote unquote advertising. And then he immediately messaged me afterwards and he goes, Matt, I feel so dirty.
Yuck.
Yeah, so he made this coffee, did the thing, walked away with some, a little bit of tidy cash, so to speak, brand, blah blah blah. But it was such a situation of he knew what he was getting into. He knew it was going to be bad, and I believe at the time he was also working for a specialty coffee roaster, and so it's
Right.
like I don't know how I feel about this.
His soul, his integrity was kind of just out the window for that one.
Absolutely. And look, let's talk this. So these companies, these big companies have definitely come along. They have had their place in the industry, and I will say this, a necessary place in the industry to afford us the opportunities of over time, the Australian idea of just figuring it out and having a go, where we've been able to look deeper into a situation because you can get an average coffee anywhere. But to get something better, these large companies have had their place to afford us, I guess, a baseline or at least a foundation for us to go, okay, now we understand what a cup of coffee is. Can I make
Yep.
it better?
Well, I guess, we collectively as Aussies have rated our coffee in Australia as being one of the best in the
Oh,
world. And I
it
think,
is hands down the best in the world.
yeah, the best in the world. And I think I remember reading something, probably maybe a fair few weeks ago. It said something along the lines of like international coffee experts consistently rank Australia among the top coffee destinations globally. Do you agree with that, Coffee Matt?
Without fail. And funnily enough, we have our own internal politic of what is the best coffee in Australia. We can talk about that later, but
Yep.
when it comes to the international scene, I will say this: I've had friends that have had roasteries in Australia or have just been baristas that have
Yep.
moved across to places like the United States or even places in. Actually, I've got two friends who now live in Scotland, I believe.
Hmm.
Scotland or Ireland, I can't quite remember. And they started a coffee shop and they're both Australian and they absolutely kill it. They're
Yeah.
doing
Yeah.
so well. And it's, they hear the accent and people immediately go, oh, sick, good coffee. Like it's a genuine thing. If you go somewhere overseas and you hear an Australian accent in a coffee shop, you turn around and go, "I will have one of whatever you're serving me, please." This weird implicit trust. Like if you go to a coffee shop in Australia and you choose any coffee shop, we feel like we're taking a risk. Like, oh, I don't know the barista, I don't really know the bean, I don't know what
Exactly.
equipment they're using. But if you go
Yeah.
overseas and you hear an Aussie, you're like, oh, okay, yes, you have my undying love.
So if you had to choose between instant coffee or Starbucks coffee, what would you choose?
Okay. Okay, we're getting into dangerous territory here.
That's
Weirdly,
good.
I've actually never been asked this question.
Well, there's always a first.
Are we talking both as they currently exist right now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Crap, that's really hard.
And death is not an option, and choosing neither is not an option either.
All right, that's tough. Okay, so instant coffee, I know too much about the industry, it's a problem. Instant coffee uses a lower quality, well, a different kind of coffee called Robusta coffee. So it grows at lower altitude and produces more of your typical coffee flavors, which is coffee and earth. And that's what
Mhm.
you expect. I gotta say, I hate to say it, but they've come a long way. I think I'd have to go Starbucks. I hate myself for
Okay.
saying that, and look, I think it's only because I know it's because I'm not blind in this scenario. It's because I know more about the industry.
What is it about Starbucks coffee that made you choose that over instant coffee?
I think it does come down to the perceived quality of the cup. I like
Mhm.
a well-made coffee, and I think the reason why I've said that is because at the start of the year, my family and I took a trip down to Tasmania just to
Okay.
see some family down there. Some really nice coffee
Mm.
down there too.
Right.
And we got to the airport in Brisbane and went into the lounge and, we're just walking around looking at the specialty shops and things. And I was like, you know what? I do need a coffee. And the only place that had what I could see with good equipment was
Mm.
a Vittoria destination. Now,
Mhm.
Vittoria are like Grinders and a few other companies, Lavazza, etc., where they're mass produced, they're an old company, they have their place in the industry. But I have never had a good Vittoria coffee before. Never. I see this young, I believe he was Korean gentleman behind the
Yep.
coffee bar was well kept, was obviously not covered in coffee, seemed to have a good skill set. I watch baristas like people
Oh, do
watch
you?
other people. Yeah, oh, 100%. This coffee was just, it wasn't $1 million, but it was well made. The espresso came out, and I looked at the top of the color. I looked at the variation on the espresso crema itself, and I was looking at the quality of it, things that I look for. And I was like, this guy has actually put some genuine effort into this. So I enjoyed that coffee more than I would from another place, purely because of the intent in the cup, the care
Oh.
in the cup.
So did he know by any means that you were also a barista?
Like I said, we had a moment. When I asked for the double espresso, I looked at him in the eyes and he looked at me, and I knew his life story and he knew mine.
That's right.
But yeah, that essentially leads me on to, if I had to have the difference between instant and Starbucks, I'll go for Starbucks, because in the last number of years, they have, at least from a PR perspective, they've upped their game. They don't use their automatic espresso machines as much as they used to. They're actually using good quality equipment from La Marzocco and Malkanig and other brands and companies that are known. And they've made their reserve roasteries, where they've put just a ridiculous amount of money into their R&D and the way that they present themselves. And I do say, I think that they will be able to do a better job than any instant coffee can possibly give you.
Oh, wow. There we go. We got the answer from the expert.
One thing that's been really interesting, listening to you talk about is just how much that goes into roasting. It was, semi simple, but, hearing about the different variables has just been an overload for me. Because obviously you are the expert when it comes to just people in general walking into a cafe, ordering a coffee, and they're drinking it. And if it tastes good, usually you move on with your day. But, once you start hearing about you talk about roast profiles, the different bean characteristics, the consistency between batches, how the weather can affect things, and how certain beans respond differently to, heat, and all the little decisions that you have to make to get the final product tasting the way you want to, you start to realize there's a whole world behind coffee that the average person never sees. When you zoom out even further, roasting is just one section of much a bigger journey, because those beans have already been grown somewhere, and they've been processed somewhere, they've been transported somewhere, and passed through a lot of different hands before they ever end up in a roaster. And it feels like these days people are becoming more interested in the story behind what they're buying as well. Whether that's where the beans came from, who produced them, and how they were sourced, and whether the people involved throughout the process are being looked after properly, and all those sorts of things that weren't really part of the conversation years ago. So now that you've started getting more involved in roasting and seeing more of what happens behind the scenes, I'm curious, has it changed the way you think about the whole journey from, farm to cup? And do you think coffee drinkers are becoming more interested in those broader parts of the industry, or do you mainly care about getting a good tasting coffee at the end of the day?
I have to approach this from a time perspective of about the last 10 years and seeing how the industry has changed. When I first started in specialty grade coffee, so really taking it seriously, was 10 to 12 years ago is when I started taking it seriously. I'd been in it for a few years by that point. And when I came into it, a guy that I worked for at the time, who taught me a little bit about roasting, introduced me to single origins, introduced me to the quality of the cup, etc. And I tried, these coffees and really enjoyed them. And the thing that I noticed when I was working for him, I was working as a chef for him at the time, was that everybody started to get really interested in the flavor notes and the quality of the cup and so on and so forth. And then it got to a peak, I'd say about 6 years ago, where people started going, what's the story of the cup? Farm to cup, as you said, or crop to cup is what we say
Yes.
every once in
Right.
a while. And people started going, oh, particularly in Melbourne. Melbourne was the driving force, and we really thank them for, and I mean this genuinely, we thank them for the level of effort that was put in by some of the roasters down there, because, and the importers as well, people like Cafe Imports and Melbourne Coffee Merchants, to name two. They really started getting to know the farmer directly, being involved in the farmer's life, helping them out with not just contributions financially, but also like agri-science or equipment that they could use, or planning for the way that the harvest schedule was going to be. Even people go on origin trips. There are a lot of roasters that do that, and they actually just, what used to be a PR stunt is now a yearly experience for them to go over to see the family again, to have a meal, to go and help on the farm, and then to establish a good financial deal for the quality of the coffee and the amount of coffee that they're getting. That hit the high note 6 years ago. I hate to say it, it's not there anymore.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and look, it will be in certain areas, and there are a lot of roasteries that are doing a damn good job. I think of one that's up on the Sunshine Coast called Slide Coffee that do a really excellent job of portraying the farm information on their tasting cards as they give you their unique coffees. For their blends, they just give you the blend card. This is what it tastes like. These are the coffees that are in there. But some of their single origins for filter and espresso based coffee, they'll give you the card and it'll tell you not just elevation and cultivar and processing method, but like, oh, such and such a farmer has owned this farm for the last X amount of generations. What they've done with this particular crop is X, Y, Z. And they do, like Slide do a great job. I've got some friends that work there. And they honestly, they do a fantastic job of it. But they are few and far between when it comes to the specialty coffee roasters. And I'll even admit, I'm very small scale. I'm barely up to creating a website, but I do want to highlight those farm unique things when I do that.
Yeah,
Because I'll say post-COVID, people just want a cup of coffee.
that's it.
And there's a lot of, and I hate this, but it's reality. There's a lot of fatigue of too much information.
It's like analysis paralysis.
That's a
Yeah.
great way of putting it. For industry people like me, I love reading the story of the cup. And I think it is an essential part of it because like you said, Matt, it had to get to the cup from somewhere. And
Absolutely.
the good thing with the importers is they invariably they have all of that information on ready-made PDF documents that they can send to you or that you can access as a roaster or even publicly. So you can go, you know what, this Guatemalan Huehuetenango coffee from the Wakan farm that I have, tell me about it. And you can get that information.
There's always like an origin story.
Absolutely. One thing that I will say is because of the access to quality technology like the Ileo bullet that I have, which is a very, very high quality item that is relatively inexpensive compared to other forms in the industry, it's now got the opportunity to allow crazy people like myself to have a go at creating something so that I think we will see micro roasteries increase exponentially from the hobbyists to people that take their hobby and go, you know what, I really want to share this with somebody. And I
Mhm.
think that it has the potential to create a groundswell movement of being able to bring people together, whether or not they are direct competition or just people trying to inspire each other, it doesn't matter. It's going to create something better in the industry. And I think the thing that's going to take it over the line of being sustainable is being able to give people, number one, really good hospitality, but very good information about the farms, the farmers, the origin story.
So like very educational as well.
Yeah, but have it in such a way where it's like, if you want to access information, please do. It's there, it's available, but I'm not going to shove it in your face.
And you mentioned something earlier about filter or espresso. So I was going to ask you as a follow up to that, do you prefer filter or espresso coffee?
Oh, filter 100% of the time, every day.
There we go. And how did you come up with the name Coffee Logic? Because you did mention your business not too long ago.
When I worked for a coffee roastery a couple of years back, I went into the nitty gritty of the science behind coffee, and I feel like I've barely scratched the surface.
Yeah.
And so I have a genuine passion for learning about the ins and outs of what makes coffee coffee in every aspect. And I got to the point of wanting to be as logical about it as possible. And of course, then, I spell logic, Logick, which is technically a Middle English way of spelling logic. And the joke is that it's the proper way to spell it. And I will say, when I used to train people in coffee, I used to be very particular, and this is espresso based coffee. I used to be very particular about the method for espresso. There is only really one way to produce that coffee so that you get that double espresso or that extraction. So essentially, you have to follow a recipe and you have to use certain kinds of equipment, and there have to be certain tolerances within this equipment and certain parameters of this recipe. And if you deviate outside of that, you will not get a good tasting coffee. Now, there are exceptions to the rule, but they are exceptions. Whereas how you present the drink, whether or not it's with more water for a long black, or whether or not you put milk in it, or whether or not you have latte art to make it pretty, or X, Y, and Z, all of that is pomp and circumstance. But producing espresso, there's only really one way to do it. The other things allow for the personal flair of the individual to be creative. And so I produced essentially the logical way of producing espresso. And that is essentially the origin of Coffee Logic. And a bunch of
Wow.
people kept on calling me a nerd when it comes to coffee, so that helps too.
Science and experience, I'd say.
Yeah,
Exactly.
actually, that's a good way of saying it. It is, you can have all of the information in the world, but if you don't have the experience behind it, then you can't really do it. You can't really replicate it.
100%. No, I agree. If you had to have a dream coffee, what would it be?
There is this region in Ethiopia called Yirgacheffe, if I'm pronouncing that properly. I still don't know. And I have Ethiopian friends too. And they have this river, I believe it's called the Abaya River or the Galana
Right.
River. It's one of the two. Anyway, this particular Ethiopian is from Galana Abaya. And when roasted slightly lighter for espresso, even though I prefer filter coffee, it produces this coffee that tastes like very sweet raspberry and a really delicate white chocolate. You put that as a double in a small flat white, just a little bit of milk on top. It is one of the most succulent, sweet experiences you could ever have. It genuinely tastes like dessert. It's a one and
Really?
done coffee, but my gosh, the roastery that I worked for at the time got this coffee and it just sung. It was such a delightful coffee to have. Whenever it was roasted, I would always steal as much of it as possible to put it on the coffee bar at the roastery so that whenever people would ask for something a little bit different, I would sing to the hills about how good this coffee was. And I would go through this full song and dance about, the origin of the coffee and how I'm producing it. And hey, quickly smell the shot before I put the milk on top. And then I'd go ahead and I'd pour a little swan or something on top just to make it fancy. And
Gotta
that
add your
is the
flair.
experience. Absolutely.
So if people want to have a real taste of your specialty coffee, where can they find you?
So I'm predominantly based on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, and I work currently at a cafe called Local Social in Forest Glen. It's just off the highway. And I usually stock my coffee there when I'm able to roast it. So usually I'm roasting on Mondays. That's my day with Coffee Logic, and I should be able to have enough supplied on the shelf for people to enjoy. The thing that I am currently doing is in the process with my wife of building our website, and that should hopefully be up and running in the next couple of weeks. So
Oh, perfect.
access to anybody that wants to look for it. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll definitely drop the links and socials of Coffee Logic below if you want to try Matt's beans, or if you are a coffee connoisseur too. All right, well, thanks for coming on the pod, Matt. Been a pleasure having you. If you like our content, lend us your support by dropping a like, comment, and subscribe. This helps us push out our podcast to more people. Thank you for listening to the Avocado Project.